Despite the fact that this is as close as most dive watches get to diving, I'd like to take a closer look today at what makes a real dive watch. Now, like all good YouTubers, I like to state the obvious. These are ducks. You can tell they're ducks because they look like ducks. But not everything that looks like a duck is a duck. The same is true for dive watches. The same thing is true for dive watches. Not everything that looks like a dive watch is an actual dive watch. This is a typical dive style watch. It has an elapsed time bezel on it, which I'll just refer to just now as a fidget spinner. But all watches that have a fidget spinner don't have ISO rating. Now, who are ISO? The ISO are the International Standards Organisation, and they set the standards for, well, lots of things really. And because diving watches were originally at least intended as a piece of safety critical equipment, there is an international standard for them. The international standard for dive watches is ISO 6425. And in order to conform to ISO 6425, a watch has to have certain visible and invisible characteristics. We'll start off just now with the invisible characteristics, because they're things that you can't verify just by looking at the watch, but you should know about them anyway. The invisible things that the watch has to conform to are covered by other standards set by the ISO. The ISO 6425 has to incorporate a shock resistance equivalent to another ISO, which is ISO 1413. Now, you can't tell if a watch is shock resistant just by looking at it or even feeling it. Sturdy build quality does not necessarily denote this. So these things have to be tested, and it's the ISO rating that manufacturers have to pay for, which adds to the cost of a dive watch. Now, as well as shock resistance, they've got to be resistant to thermal shock. In other words, going from hot conditions to cold conditions shouldn't adversely affect, well, critically the seals, but also the mechanical function of the watch. And they have to be anti-magnetic, which is another ISO standard, which is ISO 764. So these things you can't really tell. These are the invisible aspects of the ISO 6425 rating. But we can have a look at some things which are visible, and you can tell whether a watch is a real diver's watch. Now, I say diver's watch because divers with an apostrophe S is written on the dial of this watch, but this watch actually isn't a diver's watch. This is a homage to a rather famous brand of diver's watch, but it isn't in itself a diver's watch and doesn't really have the right to call itself a diver's with an apostrophe. This is quite rightly could be referred to as a dive style watch because it has a elapsed time bezel or fidget spinner, but it's not a rated dive watch. So let's have a look at some of the things that you can actually see with your eyes that make it a dive watch. Let me show you the obvious visible signs of an ISO rated dive watch. First of all, the rotating elapsed time bezel, so that you can tell how much time has passed since you set off. You start off with aligning it with your minute hand, and the minute hand will display along the bezel how many minutes, in the case of diving, you've been underwater. Now, you should notice that this bezel is unidirectional. It will rotate that way, but it won't rotate that way. Now, the reason for that is that if you set this and then accidentally knock it on something underwater, it will show you've been in the water longer than you actually have been. So if you depend on that scale and return to the surface, you're not in any danger of exhausting your air supply accidentally. Whereas if it were able to rotate the other way, you could accidentally knock it to show that you've been under the water for less time than you actually have, and that's dangerous. That's the point of the elapsed time bezel. That's what it's all for. Now, I use it to time things when I'm cooking, because I'm not a diver, and I suspect most people who buy dive watches do the same thing. Now, the crucial thing about the elapsed time bezel is the fact that the pip there at the index mark is loomed. So you're able to use this along with the loom on the hands and indices of the watch dial in order to measure time even in dark water. That's important too. If you have a dive watch which does not have an illuminated, either the bezel indices themselves or an illuminated pip, most crucially an illuminated pip, it is not a rated dive watch. It just looks a bit like a dive watch. Anyway, that's what the bezel and the pip are all about. The other thing, of course, is that the dial has to be loomed. The dial has to be loomed so you can see it underwater. Now, you couldn't have a rated dive watch, no matter how water resistant it is, if it was a digital watch where you had to press a button to illuminate it. The diver could be doing tasks and needs to be able to see the watch at a glance quickly. So it has to be self-illuminating. No button to be pressed in order to see what the time is. So a loomed dial and a unidirectional bezel with a pip so that that's also loomed. Those are visible things to do with a dive watch. Now, the Addiesdive has all of those features, but this quartz movement's just an ordinary standard quartz movement, and if the battery's weak, you won't know until the watch stops. So it's conceivable you could go away relying on this for your life underwater, and it could suddenly stop on you because the battery was about to fail when you jumped off the boat. So that's why this could never be an ISO rated dive watch, even if its water resistance was genuine. Now, other visible signs that you have a rated dive watch is the strap material. Now, you see here, this watch has a rubber strap. A rubber strap or a steel bracelet are absolutely fine, because the rule is that the strap must not be affected by salt water. So if you have a steel bracelet or even a gold bracelet, if you're crazy enough to own a solid gold Submariner, that is actually a rated dive watch, because the bracelet or strap is not affected by water. Now, you can have a nylon NATO strap on your watch, and that's alright as well, because although it gets wet, it is not weakened or affected adversely by salt water. It'll just dry out again. But if you have a leather strap on your watch, then that cannot be a rated dive watch in that configuration. Sometimes get some expensive dive watches that come with a leather strap as an option from the manufacturer. So it is a rated dive watch if it's wearing a bracelet or a rubber strap or a NATO, but not if it's on leather, which is affected by salt water no matter how it's treated. Okay, the water resistance. Now, most of you would be thinking the water resistance is the main thing. With the ISO rating, the water resistance needs to be rated. It has to be tested to 25% more than it shows on the dial. So this watch is stating 200 meters of water resistance, but it must actually have been tested 150 meters. Again, this is a fail-safe feature, because the purpose of the dive watch, at least the original purpose of the dive watch, was a piece of safety critical equipment. It's not an ornament, and it's not to time eggs. It's a piece of safety critical equipment in the time before divers all used dive computers. Now, the interesting thing about water resistance is, and this is what will surprise most of you, the minimum rated water resistance for a dive watch is only 100 meters. But let's have a look at why 100 metres is plenty just now. Well folks, look at this. You see my feet here? And do you see the most distant lamppost at the end of that pathway? That lamppost is 100 metres from here. Now that lamppost would take the fastest man in the world somewhere around 10 seconds to sprint to. And it would take you an awful lot longer to swim down that far. Now I need to tell you that a recreational diver wouldn't be diving anywhere near 100 metres. In fact, half of that would be considered the absolute limit of safety. Going down further than 100 metres requires special gases and special training and lengthy decompression stops, and it's not something you're going to do even after you're certified as a recreational diver. So I think you can see that 100 metres is actually plenty. Now that's 10% further than the distance between the goal lines on a soccer pitch. So that's a long way down. Now you could have different reasons for requiring a depth rating of greater than 100 metres. For example, it's a little known made-up fact that if you double your pressure rating of your watch, you increase your attractiveness to your chosen gender by a factor of 4. That might be a little known made-up fact, but just like the depth rating on this watch, it could be true. Another obvious way of telling if a watch could be rated as a dive watch is case material. The case material must also be unaffected by salt water. So this steel case is absolutely fine. A titanium case would be absolutely fine. Even a plastic or bioceramic case would be absolutely fine. But what wouldn't be fine is the case on this dive watch. Now, apart from the fact that this is not a superlative chronometer, it also fails at another hurdle. It doesn't have to be a chronometer to be a dive watch, by the way. I just mentioned that as a laugh because it's a cheap watch. Anyway, as you can see, the strap is a nylon NATO strap, so there's no issue there. You could put whatever spring bars you wanted on it, so there'd be no issue there. But this case is made of zinc alloy plated with chromium. And these do not stand up well to, amongst other things, salt water, because there are microscopic pores and scratches in the chromium plating which would let the salt water get near the zinc, and zinc is a reactive metal that corrodes really quite badly, usually even with the sweat from your wrist. So you cannot have a rated dive watch with a case that would be adversely affected by salt water. Now I am not sure, and answers in the comments section please, if bronze cases would be satisfactory, because bronze does tarnish, does react with salt water, but my understanding is that its strength is not affected, and it could remain, the tolerances could remain water resistant, and a bronze dive watch is a possibility. Certainly a gold dive watch, although ridiculous, is a possibility. I say ridiculous because a tool watch made of a soft precious metal just seems like a nonsense to me. But chrome plated zinc is a no-no. Okay, spring bars, just for comparison. This is a standard spring bar. Nothing wrong with that. You'll find these in most watches that you get from AliExpress, or most watches that call themselves dive watches but aren't dive watch. And this is the spring bar from the Seiko Diver. As you can see, quite a difference. And it's all about this spring bar being able to withstand a lot more force than that one before it bends and breaks. In fact, you can actually see in use the spring bar bent a little at the side, whereas this one is just as it was when it rolled out the factory. The last thing to say about dive watches is that divers don't use them anymore. Deep diving is a complex business where you're using different gas mixes, you're not just using compressed air. And there are decompression issues. You have to think about how long it's going to take you to rise back to the surface again. And for all of these reasons, nowadays divers use dive computers, which are far more sophisticated than a simple reading of elapsed time underwater. But they're fun. I love the fidget spinneriness of them. And I've been diving, and when I went diving I didn't wear a dive watch anyway. I've also been snorkeling. I've spent some time in the water, but I would be quite happy wearing any waterproof watch to do anything that I've ever done. But dive watches are cool. They're anachronistic. They are a thing that belongs to the early days of scuba diving, and we all still enjoy wearing them. Till the next time, bye for now.